Hi all, it's Tuck, Hidden Values here. Welcome to day 7 of our Liberty Vigil. It's the 25th of June, believe it or not. I've been at this every day for nearly a week. And pardon my strange setup here. I'm using my computer for the first time to do this instead of my phone. I'm having some tech issues. But I think it's going to work out acceptably well until I can come up with another alternative. I'm hoping that you guys are able to engage in this conversation through listening to videos and comments and sharing them with others and thinking about what's here, what you're finding out here, especially today, even though I'm getting to this late. If you appreciate the content, be sure to like it and subscribe and to hit the notification bell so you'll know when new things are posted. Thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and jump in to talking about our common life. Families have it, a common life, and God in Trinity has it. Spouses have it. And the earliest Christian believers had all things in common. Colleges have common rooms. Neighbors have common spaces in their neighborhoods. Communities have community things. They have a pool, a park, a youth center, or a garden. There are places to gather and be together and to live our common lives voluntarily. We do this by choice. Even in the closest of relationships between partners, spouses, and among family members, there are still boundaries within the relationships. Even in the Trinity of God exists in unconfused in persons. The three persons of Trinity are said in ancient church tradition to be unconfused in persons, even though they are one in essence. When we talk about collective endeavors, they're different than community endeavors. Right? People don't collect themselves. Things without a will collect themselves. Rainwater collects in a barrel. Leaves collect in a gutter. If we describe people in a poetic way as collecting on a sidewalk, for instance, it usually indicates kind of an aimless quality, which is different than saying that people gather somewhere, which conveys intentionality. Our language matters. People get collected by someone else. Top down. Statists collect people. They collectivize their farms, their businesses, their industries. Collective is a euphemism for taking over, either by force or by coercion. Something being collective is not just a matter of semantics, and a matter of a subtle difference between one way and another way of talking about community. There are meaningful differences between community and collectivism, and we need to be careful because our language matters. When I was in college, I was in a humanities program, and we read hundreds of books for this program over the course of our 4 years in it. But one of the most interesting ones that we read was Lenin's manifesto, which is called, actually, What is to be Done? And it's interesting because I found myself thinking of it when I was pondering the last couple of weeks about how are we really to proceed in the face of the woke mobs that are beginning to unravel our culture very, very planfully. They have a plan. It's not opportunistic, although it looks like it is. And people have begun, the resistors among us have begun in the last couple of weeks to ask this question. I've seen it in YouTube videos and in conversation and in chat online and in conversations with my friends and overheard conversations when I'm out at the store. And people are talking and saying, what are we going to do? And if people are wondering, our government's not really doing the things we expected, right? They're not supporting the police and backing them up, they're accusing the police. They're talking about defunding the police. And the president says things, but then doesn't seem to hold governors and mayors' feet to the fire. And some governors and mayors seem to be sort of abandoning this fight, and everybody's kind of waiting for the rioters to get it out of their system. But they seem to be escalating. They don't seem to be drawing to a close. So we need to really be thinking about what we're going to do. And as I've pondered this over the last few weeks, I've kind of come to basically a top 10 list, a way that we could consider proceeding. And so I wanted to invite all of you into that, just to consider what ways we might move forward as folks that want to resist the taking over of our country by a group of people who have a really different outcome in mind for our life in America in the near future. First of all, we can summon our courage. We can stop avoiding or resist the urge to avoid difficult realities because they don't happen to be affecting us directly today. For those of us who are a little bit insulated by the way that we're living or the place that we're living, we can make a point of paying attention, thinking about, and if we're so inclined, to pray about our own convictions, opinions, and questions about our country's current struggles. Secondly, we can use careful and accurate language in describing and discussing the situation that we find ourselves in our country. We can make sure that we clear up our own confusion and come to a settled place about the language that we use in open conversation with other people. We can speak with courage. We can make sure we don't mince words to avoid offending, but at the same time exercise some patience and some self-control so that we're not just venting recklessly in public in a way that's unkind or counterproductive. Thirdly, we can make a stand for our liberty when we're called upon to do it. Again, there's no need to be reckless or to alienate people unnecessarily, but pardon me, I was at a town hall once in 2008 when some of the beginnings of this most recent chapter of difficulty were beginning, and a man stood up and said that he liked to think of liberty as freedom under self-control, so that freedom didn't just degrade into license. And I thought that was a really good observation. And if we're going to make a stand for that kind of liberty, a sense of our freedom that's been brought under self-control and discipline, then we need to think about what it would mean to refuse to submit to the demands of tyrants of any kind, as they seem to be presenting themselves to us with their demands these days. But it's important that we reflect ahead of time on what the consequences might be if we refuse. And we think about the consequences not only to ourselves, but to the other people in our lives, and maybe discuss with them what that might look like to refuse, and really contemplate which of those consequences we are willing to embrace. It's important, fourthly, that we stay in touch, that we connect with those in our own family, in our faith community, and in our geographical area, even people we might not know yet, but that we might need to rely upon one another if we are going to resist tyranny. We need to observe, obviously, common sense practices, in that we are still needing to stay aware of this virus that we have to cope with, and also just other kinds of illness and people's different lifestyles and different vulnerabilities. Everyone's in a different situation, and we need to respect people's limits and their wishes and their boundaries. But we also need to reach out to one another and stay connected. There's been some talk that there may be some interference with our electronic availability to one another, and I don't know entirely the sources of that or the reliability of that conversation, but it certainly would be wise for us to make some plans around being available to each other in person and not just electronically to whatever degree we can. And also then, of course, to stay in touch electronically as long and as many ways as we can across the greater distance, which is, of course, what this channel is about and what these talks are about. So hopefully we'll continue this conversation that way. Fifth, we need to encourage one another. We need to literally impart courage. The word for courage is from the French word for heart. We need to strengthen one another's hearts, reminding one another that this coalition of woke separatist tyrants is promoting ideas that are destructive of human flourishing, which makes them immoral. And I'm indebted to Kevin Corke, actually, for the first public use I heard of the term separatist when he was reporting on the attempted takeover of Lafayette Park in Washington. I thought it was really the perfect term because it reminds us that we are not the ones who are attempting to do away with our American way of life and our founding principles. It is actually these other folks that are wanting to separate themselves. It is actually the woke mob in the streets that's doing that. It is not those of us that are resisting them that are attempting to do away with our way of life. Sixth, it may be that a time will come when we would have to withdraw our consent because governments, we're told, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Federalism gives us different levels of authority, from federal to state to local authorities, whether that's municipalities or counties or HOAs or townships or whatever it is. And if any of these attempts to eradicate our ability to speak or to compel us to speak in a particular way, or if they are engaging in practices that allow or support the woke coalition forces in doing these things, then we may need to withdraw our consent and our support for their authority to govern us. The woke separatist coalition has allies among the authorities. Some of them have been co-opted and they actually have bought in to woke messaging. Others have just been cowed and they're afraid of the consequences if they join a resistance to that. I would argue that we're not obligated to acknowledge their authority over us, these allies, because they've delegitimized themselves by allying themselves with tyrants against the founding principles of our constitutional republic. And for those of us who feel differently, we are absolutely within our rights to withhold our allegiance to their authority in favor of the principles that are espoused in our founding documents. Seventh, we need to correctly identify the players, because there are really, it seems to me, 4 kinds of folks involved in this woke separatist coalition. There are leaders, most of whom we can't identify and we can't see. They're behind the scenes, probably for several reasons. I imagine partly because it's harder to stop them, and because if they can stay hidden, it won't become apparent that they are acting hypocritically. This movement is identifying itself and making its claims on the basis that it is acting from a position of victimization and a need for redress of grievances because it's in a position of disadvantage. And my suspicion is that the leaders of this movement are actually in a place of tremendous wealth and advantage. And so the hypocrisy of that won't be exposed as long as they're in hiding. There are also mouthpieces of this movement, and those are the folks that are posing or have been posed as the leaders. They're the folks that are out front, they're giving interviews, they're organizing and acting as the public faces of the movement. Third, and most numerously, are the pawns of the movement. These are the street level folks. Some of them are sadly needy attention seekers. Some are bored or frustrated coronavirus lockdown victims that have found their only government approved get out of jail free card and are taking advantage of that, understandably. Some are probably deluded, some are shallow thinking, some are poorly educated. but all of various ages and skin colors. Many are well-meaning and have compassion for people that they think are hurting. Some of them are hurting. But in all cases, they have believed a narrative which has a kernel of truth in it, but has all kinds of layers of untruth on top of that. And it has been sold to them, and they have bought it. And that narrative is a weaving of a fiction around a truthful reality that says that there's both a painful history of racism and a huge promise of opportunity in America. That's the truth. And there's an interweaving of those two things in our history, and the narrative gets the proportions of that and the history of that wildly wrong. And these are folks that have really bought into a very mistaken version of that. There are also allies, and these are growing in number. They are utterly self-serving. They are seeking to preserve their own advantage. These folks are well educated for the most part, and many of them are wealthy. They know better than the warped story, but they have sold out to it. They're fearful of both personal and financial ruin, and they are also taking care of their families and their own safety, which is understandable. They lack the courage to defend the country that has offered them opportunity, which is not acceptable. Eighth, what we need to do is build an alternate system, an alternate network of function, because the existing one has already been infiltrated by these 4 different categories of people that are involved in this movement. And it's past the point of recovery. When I went to figure out how exactly to disengage from people in the woke business community, I realized that there are 5 different technology companies that I use to be able to be online and to have a phone and to function in the world. Every one of them is on the woke list. There's not a way for me to disengage from this without joining my Amish neighbors. Honestly, I would have to change my lifestyle that much, which is not practical. It's not something that we can do and actually communicate with one another and maintain what we need to take our country back. So we're going to need to find another pathway, because otherwise, when this little house of cards the tyrants have built comes to collapse, it's going to be our collapse too, if there's not some sort of backup system. So as with the founders, our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor depend upon having a secondary system that will become the primary one when the impostor's tyrannical anarcho-statist movement collapses of its own fantastical utopian weight, which it will if enough of us stand up to it. At that point, then the legitimate concerns that every American citizen has about the value of all lives and about maintaining and returning pro-social behavior to every part of our American life will be able to be addressed in a saner and calmer environment. In the meantime, number 10, we must insist loudly and long that the lies these people are telling are not the truth. No matter how much noise and violence threaten to create a fog of war, we have to remain clear about the fact that the woke separatist coalition is just today's opportunistic arm of a very long-standing tyrannical anarcho-statist movement. It has been around for over 100 years, and this is just the latest iteration of it. They are the mutineers against the legitimate authority structures of our country's founding ideals, and they are seeking to overthrow what we have known for such a long time. If we choose to defend our country against the advance of their ideology, we are the resistors of their intended revolution. We are not the revolutionaries. We are the patriots, and they are the traitors to the original cause of the founders of this country. And we need to recover our country. Thanks for joining me. I hope that you will be back tomorrow. I invite your comments and observations. Thank you. Have a good night.